Thank you, Nancy, very much. And I want to thank all of you, and especially Catherine, for the invitation to be here. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to talk to one of the first global audiences that I have had the privilege to address since I started to think about the concepts I'm going to talk about today in more than just U.S. domestic terms. I'm now thinking about them as a world. You heard some statistics earlier, and I'm going to tweak them just a bit. There were, about 100 years ago, 2 billion of us on the planet. And at that time, it took 384 days to circumnavigate the globe. Today, there are 6 billion of us, and as you know well, you can get on an airplane and be anywhere in just about a day. It says we truly have a very small world. We are truly one family here. And we do move around a lot and visit each other a lot, not only for social but for economic reasons. 10 million people cross a border every day, most of them seeking work. So those kinds of numbers have become very compelling to me as I think about what it means to heal and to provide healthcare services in the world. I don't have any slides. What I'm about to say is captured and is on the PBIRG website, so you will be able to find it there. There's no need really to take notes. I encourage you, however, if you want to write something, to begin to write what these kinds of concepts might mean to the work that you do and to that this industry does on a day-to-day basis, and also questions, because after this we're going to have a dialogue with you, and I think that's going to be an exciting way to end the morning. Before I continue, though, you know something about me. I want to know a little bit more about you. Are there pharmacists in the audience? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. How about nurses? Are there nurses here? What about physicians or surgeons? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah. Okay. Are there any healers here? That was a trick question. By the end of this morning's presentation and the time we have together, I hope I can convince you that you are all healers. And that during the time that we have together, that you will give some consideration to what it means now to be a healer, and particularly within this pharmaceutical industry, and particularly at a time in which you've heard such compelling challenges laid out for you today. I'm going to shift the paradigm here. If I had a title slide, it would be the branding message from Monty Python, now for something completely different. Now, why am I doing that? You heard that I have a very strong background and experience in both the public and the private sectors in public policy. I was very privileged. I was part of the Reagan administration. Some of you may now remember those as the good old days, and also part of a world-class pharmaceutical company. And during that time, I considered myself to be the typhoid Mary of public policy. I took it everywhere. I was convinced, having come from a high-level government position, that policy was valuable. It was a way to identify problems and to seek out solutions and to create the relationships that would create the change, that would improve the health of the people. And at the time, the people I cared about were principally in the United States, but also in the world as well. I exhorted everyone everywhere I went to just get involved. Well, I have to tell you something. I failed. Because I was not able to make a convincing and compelling enough case for this industry, which I feel is the gateway to true health, was not able to convince this industry to become more substantially involved in all of the critical challenges that you have had laid out for you this morning. And as a result of that, we are where we are right now in the United States and in the world in facing these kinds of challenges. Now, I finally understood, after a lot of failures, how to talk to people in marketing. I finally convinced them that public policy and government affairs was not just a social play. It was not just a lot of fun, but that there were 4 critical things that government could do to you. Only 4. Government decides who's going to get into the market, how they are going to behave when they are there, whether they will make any money, and if they do, whether they will keep it. And I finally understood that that's what marketing was all about. Now, what I was unable to do was convince marketing that the people in government were their customers and that therefore they ought to be talking to them, they ought to be looking at them, they ought to be researching what their attitudes were. In addition to that, I also failed to show them how it was that the public, the constituency of these politicians and governments, drove the process. Government does not lead, it follows. And so as a result of that, not taking a substantial enough or deep enough or qualitative enough look at what was happening to the customers, the people, not only who were patients, but the people who were physicians and who therefore, if they didn't like something that the industry was doing, could take to their governments to have change. Because of that failure, I think this is where we are today. So what I did was retire to the privacy of my own study for a couple of months and think about this. I thought, well, what do we do strategically next? Is there a way that we can leapfrog over all of the challenges that we have today? What do we need next? I'm a social scientist by training, and so I went back to the fundamentals of healing. And what I'm about to say is a paradigm shift, and I want to say that I don't think there are a lot of people who can articulate what I'm about to say today, but they feel it in their guts. And so when I talk about it, they shake their heads and they say, yeah, you're right. This is where we are today. And where we are today as healers within the pharmaceutical sector is that the public feels that we have broken the healer's covenant with them. Now, I want to tell you, healers historically have held a very privileged place within their society, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Healers were always rewarded. Profit is not a dirty word for a healer. Healers were always given the resources that they needed in order to sustain themselves and the healing ventures that they needed within the communities that they served. But they dared not deny their healing services to anyone who needed it. And I think that's what the public is telling the industry today. You have denied us the value of what you have produced. So is innovation enough? No, it is not. Innovation is only the start of the process. Until every patient has every product that they need that is available, then it is not enough. Now, where did this come from? It came from this concept of covenants. And covenants were a way in which early man structured relationships within their communities. There were covenants between husbands and wives, between fathers and sons, between the kings and their subjects. And over time, these covenant sort of perspectives got picked up and adopted within the healing systems of the society. Now, there's an important other piece to this, and I know I'm talking to a secular audience, not a religious one, but I'm going to have to introduce a couple of the concepts from covenant that appear in the religious literature of our common Judeo-Christian culture. Because in every culture that we know of, north, south, east, west, it does not matter, there are two things that come from God, or in the polytheistic cultures, the gods, and that's the law and the healing arts. If you're at all interested in the law, Alan Dershowitz has written the companion book to mine. It's called The Genesis of Justice. And it's how our judicial systems are structured, growing out of that literature in the Judaic tradition in Genesis. Now, the law structured how you would deal with an infringement from your neighbor. If you had a falling out with another person, it was the law that you went to resolve that. What did you do when disease struck you? What did you do when one of the gods, Febris being one, for example, sent you a fever? What did you do when some evil force like Sethapop sent you a disease? Well, you turned to the divine. You turned to the more powerful one. You turned to God. As a result of that, the healer class and the priest class were one and the same. This was the class that intervened for you in the context of these very powerful, frightening forces of disease that were befalling you. Now, some people look at me and say, oh, yes, but we're all scientific now, and we don't believe that the god febris causes fevers. But guess what? We've got genomics. And I'm going to tell you something. I don't think that makes it any easier. I don't think that even when we understand the mechanisms of disease, that it is any less mysterious or any less terrifying. When you are sick, it's scary, and you want help. And so in my mind, it's no mistake, it's no accident, that we have so many jokes about doctors and God. That is, in fact, what the culture expects of our healer. Now, that's why the covenants became so important. Covenant relationships are essentially different than contract relationships. A covenant says we are in this together, there is no getting out of it. You are a healer 24 hours a day. You are sitting in this meeting, you are a healer right now. You are a doctor driving home from work, you are filling up your car with gas. If somebody has a heart attack in that gas station, you are a doctor right now. There is no getting out of it. Covenants have a particular structure. They actually have an oath, the oath of Hippocrates. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. You start out, you call upon the gods to witness what you are about to say. You promise things, and in the end you say, and if I do these things, may good come to me, and if I do not, may the reverse be my lot. You actually invoke a curse upon yourself if you fail to operate within a covenant. Now, a contract is essentially different. A contract has a beginning, it has an end, and you are only in a contract when you have to perform for it. So your gas station mechanic is not your mechanic when he's having supper, only when he's working on your car. A contract also presumes that someone will fail. And so that is, if you've done these business deals, you know you have lawyers at each elbow telling you how the other person just might fail, and therefore what you need to write into the contract to punish him accordingly. So it says, if you fail, here's what you owe me. If I fail, here's what I owe you. My personal definition of hell is having to live within covenants and contracts at the same time, and that's what we're doing in healthcare today. It's untenable. A little bit more about these covenants. I said I'd talk about the oath of Hippocrates. The physicians here who raised their hand, did you take the oath of Hippocrates? Was it, can I see some heads nod, or was it the prayer of Maimonides? Okay. There are two essential oaths. The oath of Hippocrates is structured along the lines of two kinds of covenant, and these really are important to my whole message, so I'm going to spend a moment just to talk about those. There are covenants of grant and covenants of obligation. Back to a story from biblical sources. The covenant of grant, we know best in our common Judeo-Christian culture, is the one between God and Noah. This is when God says to Noah, I won't destroy the earth anymore by flood, but Noah doesn't have to do anything for that. He just gets it. It's not until Sinai that you see what's called the covenant of obligation. You do this and I'll do that, and we are all in it together. The divine, the healer, the patient, the community, all in it together. Well, the oath of Hippocrates is both types. It's a covenant of obligation, but only among the healers. So it says, I'll study and I'll learn and I'll teach my fellows and I will treat his sons as my sons. And it even says in some ancient versions of the oath, we will live together. That's a covenant. You're in it together. But then it says, I will grant health to the patient. You hear that? The patient need do nothing in order to be granted this great bounty from the divine through the healer. Seems to me that's very untenable. In healthcare financing systems which have now been linked with healing systems, when the patient has no skin in that game, except the very hide on their bodies, and expects it to be granted. It's not until about 1200 a man named Maimonides comes along. He is a brilliant physician, theologian, and philosopher. He rewrites the oath of Hippocrates, and he adds, and may the patient take my prescriptions and follow my advice and avoid the advice of meddlesome friends and relatives who don't know what they're doing and will kill him. So it's the first time that we see obligation introduced into the covenant. Now, unfortunately, in the developed world, and increasingly I believe I am seeing in our developed world relationships with the developing world, what we are operating on is a covenant of grant with our patients. And it's simply untenable as the population ages, as scientists do produce these technologies as they come out of the pipeline, and also as we become increasingly more demanding for that, particularly here in the United States. Well, I have a prescription for this. It has 3 parts. The first part is a covenant of obligation, and this time among all healers. And in my opinion, a healer is anyone, as I said, all of you included, who touches health care. Our societies are more complex today. Our knowledge is much more vast. It is organized in ways that requires all of us to be participants. Because our societies are more complex, the nature of our healers is more complex. So that includes government bureaucrats, and that includes health insurance executives, and that includes human resources, people and companies who make decisions about what kind of health care they will provide to their employees. It includes Peter Jennings, by the way, and I always say him in my speeches, so I'm pleased to see that you know him, because maybe now I'll get to meet. I'm saying it because I want to meet him, and I think if I drop his name enough, maybe I'll have a chance to do that. When I talked to the Academy of Family Physicians at their meeting in Florida, I told them, I said, you know, Peter Jennings is going to spend more time this year talking to your patients about health care than you will. And by the way, what is he saying? We have, for the traditional healers, the nurses, the pharmacists, the physical therapists, the doctors, an elaborate system of education and accreditation and licensing and so on in order to assure that the inputs are good. And the same thing is true of pharmaceutical products. We know pretty well we'd like to know better, but we know pretty well what's going out there to the patients. And yet we don't know what Peter Jennings is saying and if it's any good. Now, no study has been done on the American media, but one was done on the Canadian press, found that 50% of the information was wrong and 25% was potentially deadly if followed. Now, in this country, we accredit weathermen to tell us whether tomorrow is going to be a good day to play golf or take a flight. But we do not accredit those people who talk about health and healing. And it seems to me it's about time, and this is one of my other messages throughout, is that there be some parity, that there be parity across all of the healers, that we begin to be responsible and accountable to one another. When I spoke to the Disease Management Association of America, they were thinking about accrediting disease management companies and products. And they said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, I think that that's a good idea. I think it is important for one healer to be able to demonstrate to another that they are doing a good job. I'd like to see us accredit patients. By the way, I'll get to that in just a minute. I'd like to see some accrediting of communities. That's part of my solutions down the line. So, but those are the kinds of now healers, in my opinion, have got to come together, and we have got to stop fighting. And that's, you know, right now the hospitals are fighting the doctors who are fighting the pharmaceutical industry. If you get the dollar, I won't get the dollar. We're arguing about a piece of the pie, and we forgot that now somebody bought the bakery. They don't want pies anymore. The public is angry. They are very, very angry. And what is happening as the anger has come from the outside into our healing systems is that we have turned upon one another in a sort of an attitude of scarcity. The reality is we've got plenty of money to spend on health care if we want. We've just decided not to spend it. In this country, we spend $100 billion a year on fast food, something that's killing us. We spend $24 billion accessorizing our cars and our trucks, and $1 billion on Valentine's Day chocolate alone. Now tell me again we cannot afford co-pays for our drugs. We have decided we don't want to. And I think that that's one of the challenges we have as healers, and one of the things that we need to do a lot better. This is a mess we created. In this covenant of grant mentality that just said you could get it, we failed to communicate with patients. I wrote an op-ed no one will publish about the Patient Bill of Rights. And essentially the notion was if a patient can sue an HMO, then can an HMO sue a patient, and why not? I used hypertension as the example, listed everything that the healer had to do to care for a hypertensive patient, and then showed how the patient didn't have to do anything, including taking the medicine. And yet when the heart attack or the stroke came, the healer had to take care of them still within a capitated fee or some highly discounted fee for service, a large group leveraged rate. And that, it seems to me, is untenable and is part of that pressure that is driving us as healers against each other. The enemy is ignorance and disease. It is not the healer who sits at the other side of the table. And I am convinced that if we can open up and as healers work with one another, we can begin to convince people of that. So that's the second part of my prescription. Now all healers need to call patients into a covenant, and this time a covenant of obligation. Something that says, if you do this, I will do that. Let's be in this together. And so we need to start talking about what that means and how we operationalize that in our day-to-day lives. And I encourage and implore you in the work that you do to look at the way you word your questions and to look for ways in which patients will be called into a sense of responsibility. What is that going to take? Not Coke, but Pepsi, I hear. 7 repetitions a week to continue to get us to drink diet sodas, Diet Pepsi. Well, I'm not sure that patients or communities are ever going to pay for the kinds of information systems that are going to remind people daily to take their medications. And by the way, I think that's unreasonable, and we don't have to do that. What I think we have done as healers is to create dependencies in our patients. We are treating them like children, and they're acting like it. They are just expecting it. Now, by the way, I do think that there is a special segment of patients who are growing up, and now they're in their adolescence. So unlike me when I was a child and the food just showed up, I didn't really know where it came from, they have become adolescents who, like me, wanted the keys to my dad's car and wanted him to put the gas in it, but I did not want to tell him where I was going. And so now as patients, some of us are that adolescent. I will decide whether or not I will take my medicines, and if I'm going to combine it with herbals and OTCs and other things, and whether or not I will tell my surgeons, even though the combination might be deadly on the operating room table. Adolescence is a normal part of human development, but it would be an awful place to get stuck, either for an individual or for a group of people. And what I am hoping we can do now as healers is pull people all the way through to interdependence and realize we are all in this together. Down the street from me in southeastern Pennsylvania is a family practice group. They consistently have the highest quality ratings of any plan in the region, and they will be out of business in 2 years. Because of everything that is happening to squeeze them, they will not be there. I don't know if their patients know about that, but I think their patients should. And if that happened to be the group that took care of me, it's not. But it makes me wonder about my own. Will they be there in 2 years? And will I be able to get a physician? So that's the second part of the prescription. The third part then is that whole communities need to come into this covenant of obligation as well. And I define communities as broadly and variously as I define healers. A community is any group of people, in my opinion, who comes together and calls themselves one. So it could be a town, it could be a municipality of some sort, it could be the nation, it could be the world community, it could be an employer group, it could be a church, it could be a collection of people who come together on the internet, realizing that they are all in it together. And again, encouraging accountability with one another. As an employer, for example, I care about the health of my employees. I hope that my employees also care about one another's health and that they will do things like become immunized so that they do not bring influenza to the office, because the consequences will reduce our productivity and therefore our profits. Within communities, it seems to me, is where we need to now start addressing the social issues that are driving disease. One of the problems that we have is that too many of these social problems have been renamed healthcare problems. So if you don't want to deal as a community with the sexuality of your teenagers, that when your babies have babies and the healthcare system gives you a good neonatal intensive care system, you should expect to have to pay for that. But our communities don't, because they're just as dependent as our patients are, because they too are living within this covenant of grant and do not see an obligation. In addition to that, when our communities decide we're not going to take care of our elderly parents within our own homes or within some alternative setting, but it's a healthcare problem, again, a community should expect to have to pay for that. And children and guns, If I was a healer in Littleton, Colorado, then as soon as the dust had settled, I think I would have collected all of the leaders of the community around and said, you know, you've proven you can't handle guns and kids. And we are willing to patch them up, and we will do the best job we can with their bodies and their minds. But it's going to cost you. Where do we send the bill? So that's my prescription. How do we get started on all of this? We get started because the healers will decide to do that. And I'm privileged today to talk to a little more than 300 of them. One thing about covenants, they proceed from the superior party down. Now, my editors have not wanted me to write about this very much, but I talk about it. You know, it's not very politically correct these days to talk about superior parties, but I think healers are. And I think, by the way, the community and the patients expect us to be. We are superior by virtue of our education and the training, part of which we have because they supported educational institutions with tax dollars. We are superior because we have been given the tools to do this work. We've been given intellectual property protection. And we are superiors because whether you know it or not, you are implicitly a part of the covenant and they expect you to be. And so it seems to me that here's where we start. I'm hoping that today, as you listen to this, that you begin to think of one person, just one, that you can relate to healer. What other thing can you do that will give your work the kind of meaning that healers have, which is in being in league with powerful forces in order to bring people into peace and into life in healthcare? This, it seems to me, is a critical thing that we all need to think about now as healers, because the consequences of the diseases that we are facing are enormous. You've already heard statistics about HIV. Well, it's worse than that. In South Africa, 40% of the teachers have HIV, and the universities cannot produce teachers fast enough to replace the ones who are dying. In every company in the urban areas, they are now training 2 people for every job because one of them will die. The economic gains of the last 10 years in Africa have been wiped out by AIDS. Heads of households are now 13 years old because they buried their parents and they are now taking care of younger siblings. How? On an antiviral regimen. Really, can they do that? This is the world that we are going to give our children. Can we afford to give them this world? I don't think so. Can we afford to help? Absolutely we can. I don't have the statistics in my head anyway on worldwide assets, but I do here in the United States. If we were to, and disparities in wealth, if we in the United States were to look at the bottom 10% of our socioeconomic population, and we believe they are poor and needy, they are better off than 66% of the world's population. It seems to me that this is now an issue in which the average American needs to begin to support the work that will happen to improve the health of the developing world. And America needs to begin to engage Europe and the other developed nations in how we are going to do this together. That is where I hope we can lead. Now, for my part of this, I have been encouraged by some people to talk about the covenants that I hold dear and some of what I do to make that kind of a difference. The first thing I want to say is that I engage in a covenant with everyone who is in an audience before which I speak. And for the next 30 days, I offer you a free consult. If you get into a project and you say, gee, I wonder if this has a covenant twist on it, call me and I'll talk to you at no charge. You can reach me. My email is on the sheet that you have, and through PBIRG you can reach me as well. The second part of my covenant is that all of the proceeds from my book, which you have received from Genetics for this meeting, go to a foundation, and that foundation funds projects for women and children in the developing world. We have so much here, and I personally have so much. I have been so blessed, not just in the opportunity to come and talk to groups like this one and to look at issues like this in hopes that it will help us to move beyond the rancor, the anger, and the challenges that we are facing. We'll hope that we can, I hope, this can help to shift the paradigm, but I have been blessed economically in doing so, and so it is my intention to make that available to really the poorest of the poor, who are the women and the children in those nations that I've talked about and care about so much in terms of the devastation of disease that they are facing. I hope in some small way I've contributed to your ongoing dialogue, and I thank you very much for your attention. And now, Nancy, I'll turn this back to you for our discussion.
Thank you, Glenna. And now it's time to open up the floor to you.